So, okay, everyone, welcome to the first CLM of the summer session. New date, new time, new technology. So what could go wrong? This is going to be our new date and time going forward. We waited till the end of D term to secure the room at 1 p.m. Chief, if you want to get the door, just so I'm not shouting out over there. It's the end. It's summer now, so no one can claim the room but us, and we've actually reserved the room for about 2 years in the schedule. So we have the room. We've basically done the classic bureaucratic move of wait till no one can say no and then seized it, and we'll plant our flag here. We're also trying business for Skype, or Skype for Business technology, which WPI has access to. A lot of universities do. Hopefully this should resolve some of the issues about transmission rates, readability. We also can record a little bit easier. So Rafat said he couldn't see the slides. We are going to be recording these and posting these up for recordings later. So hopefully with this, we're going to resolve some of those outstanding issues, and we'll go ahead and get started if there's no questions. Okay. All right, so this is the second lean proof presentation. The first one I did probably about a month ago. And what questions do I need help with today? This is my writing clear? The answer is no. So I already admit that my writing is clear, but since I need clarity in the writing, I'm looking for feedback on clarity without losing the fidelity. I'm looking for challenge of the logic of the theory. So as I make the premises and kind of work through them, say that doesn't make sense, I think you're missing something, but I ask not to nitpick the definitions. Mainly what happens in Lean a lot is they say, well, we're healthcare, so that's a different word here, or you haven't included the right term. I'm trying to make the definitions as exhaustive as possible, but I don't want to have lines and lines. And then with the system dynamics, definitely the definition of a Lean module, we talk about validity and building confidence. Does the definition of a Lean module satisfy validity? Does it build confidence? Does this, as a theory that uses system dynamics to demonstrate a theory, have validity? So what problems am I trying to solve? As we reviewed last time, this is a quick overview. Last presentation was the literature review, the rationale, the motivation. There is no accepted fundamental theory of Lean, which is stunning to me as someone who spent 20 years in the field. No one can agree or even has proposed a fundamental theory, which means when you're out in the field, there's ambiguity. It can be anything anyone wants it to be. That creates a proliferation of tools. Different definitions get argued about. This creates actual costs. People do implementations and they fail, and they say, well, it leans wrong or it's not working. It also creates opportunity costs that people avoid it. There's also systems thinking is largely ignored in Lean, even though it's a key concept described in Lean. And Lean, if we think about Lean as a parable, we use the phrase archetypes and system dynamics and parable. If Lean were treated as a parable, that parable has now spread into things like Agile, scaled Agile framework, DevOps. These are more IT-based methodologies, but they have their basis in Lean. Agile Manifesto credits Lean as a lot of its foundation. But so when you think about, you hear Agile, you hear about sprints and Kanbans. These things come from Lean, but if Lean is confusing, then Agile doesn't even go into the depth Lean does, and now they're spreading even further. So it's kind of like perpetuating this confusion. And I'm not trying to solve all those things. I'm simply saying these are some of the problems that originate from not having a fundamental theory.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
And when you say theory here, I assume that you mean it in the conventional sense, that there are hypotheses that are testable,
yes,
and it's falsifiable, yep, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct. I am proposing that there is no way to falsify Lean currently. There is no testable, falsifiable way of describing Lean.
Some of these other methodologies, so-called, they're more heuristics than anything else. Right?
Well, and that's the question: is Lean only a heuristic? I mean, if we get to a falsifiable state and you wipe out all of Lean because it is purely a heuristic, well, then there is. I mean, it's possible this is just business heuristics, good social practices, common sense, pragmatics. There's been a description that maybe that's all it is, right? Good business practices with a little bit of common sense, some cultural lingo thrown in, and that's okay. But the question is there something more fundamental? And if so, can we prove it? Or at least, not axiomatically like a physics experiment, but at least within the concept of a social science, prove it, or at least build validity in that these things work under certain contingencies. These are the definitions. Goods and services, I just want to use broadly to define a lot of different things. Consumer goods and services, delivery of public services, so a government agency delivering to taxpayers, constituents, public and private education, healthcare, national security, military. This is things that organizations provide. Delivery, all sorts of mediums, manufacture, production, creation, everything, all those providers. These are the people who create the goods and services and deliver them. I understand there's supply chain variations. There's all sorts of things. I'm trying to stay away from getting really ticky-tack into division right now, keep it very simple. But private for-profit companies, nonprofits, volunteers, military commands, hospitals, political parties, they're providing something. Recipients are organizations, and this is a key definition. This is where I want to focus on. Recipients are organizations external to the providers who require the goods and services. So these are the people who receive something from the provider. Now they could include customers, clients, aid recipients from volunteers, beneficiaries, the public service, taxpayers, patients. The energies are all the inputs that the providers put into something. In business, this might be your cost, your dollars, your labor, your work hours, your experience. In volunteer, it may be time. It's just a collection of energy, time, and resources you put into this. The return is what the recipients give back. And for the economists in the room, you may be laughing that there are much easier terms for all this stuff, and maybe I'm going that way. But I'm also trying to make this understandable to a layperson in business, and also who may not be in business but may be in a hospital or military command. But it could be a monetary compensation, a budgetary allotment, a public official allots a budget to a police provides a public good to a recipient provides taxes back, which is in the budget. The public benefit, the last one, is meant to include compliance with a law or regulation, ensuring safety of people and the environment, and pursuing other public benefits. So these are some definitions, just to get out of the way, and assume that these are right. They may not be, but let's assume for the sake of these definitions. Go ahead, Saeed.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think a synonym for energies in economics parlance could be production factors.
Production factors? Okay.
Is there a way to increase this volume?
Saeed, can you increase your, oh, we don't have volume here.
Yeah, there would be production or economic resources, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial.
Production factors?
Production factors or economic resources.
Right.
And the returns would be wages, interest, profit, rent.
Okay. Is there one word that captures that? So that each time you're doing it, you don't have to just put that whole, because I'm going to start using these in sentences, and I'm trying to get it down to a short
resources
term.
And returns. I
Resources
guess,
and returns.
You probably would say in economics.
Okay.
But the point is, there are exact parallels.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Then that's exactly the feedback I want us to try and get clearer to where people can understand it. It doesn't get loaded down, but yet. So with all that, now we're getting into the theory. The first principle is that lean theory is an organizational approach adopted by providers to balance energies, production factors, to the return provided by recipients on whose behalf goods and services are delivered. Right? It's very basic, it's very simple, it's probably not different than a whole lot of other stuff that's out there. Any questions so far? The only thing that's possibly different here is the definition is the recipients are always external to the organization. So in this theory, it does not say that the recipients are ever internal to the organization. Questions?
So you're saying that lean wouldn't apply to internal consulting?
It could apply, but ultimately it is done on behalf of an external recipient. The reason you do it is because of the chain that results in a benefit to an external recipient.
Okay, but the Toyota folks did it for themselves, right?
That's debatable. I think they did it because they needed to compete. And the benefits, even for things like employee morale, they realized the cost of losing employees would make them uncompetitive. But I think we're going to get, and it gets to this next definition of how you define value and who defines it.
Yeah, fine. I just think from Toyota, because that was developed, I think, by them, for them.
But it was developed to react to scarce resources in Japan at the time. So it was an external, and they were competing for car. They were, and if you read I don't want to get too much into it, but they're reacting to Japanese consumers and American consumers and sort of creating things to that. When they were a loom manufacturer, they're reacting to the people buying looms. So, but it's a good point. I struggle with the internal because there is an internal argument, and for now I made it that it is external only. And the reason why gets to this first premise. It is the recipients, not the providers, who define the utility in the goods and services and the return provided for that. And this gets right to that definition. That the recipients are external. That means the person who defines the utility lies outside your organization. And if it's a public benefit where there's no obvious recipient, the law, regulation, consensus, or proxy shall define the utility in goods and services that deliver the public benefit. So what we've got now is somebody outside the organization defines the value of what you do, which again, I'm hoping is not too controversial at this point. Okay.
Random thought. If you're talking about trying to develop a theory, does it really matter whether it's external or internal?
Yes.
It's a law of the universe, right?
Well, for lean specifically, I think it matters because what's coming up.
Okay.
And this, somehow the words got lost. This first premise, these things that they define are called value. So the first premise, the words got dropped. These things that they define are collectively called value. So they're defining, this is the first term that's a lean term. It's a term used elsewhere, but the first premise, the term is value. The second premise is the value, because they define it, one of the things they define is when they're ready to receive. This means the rate at which providers can deliver goods and services is outside the control of their organization, and this rate is termed pull. So now we have a very specific lean concept, which is you have to match the rate of production at the rate of receipt to someone outside your organization. And that's why that definition became so difficult for me, is you can, obviously there's a benefit of doing internal. Almost half my career was internal based things. But ultimately, if you say, why are we doing this? And it's not to some outside definition, it can always become self-serving. So I think the critical part of the lean theory is the definition of what is the value, and therefore what is value add lies outside the boundary.
Right. So that second bullet, and then that bullet right there is basically just, it's just the rate of uptake that you can entertain, basically, by a recipient, right?
Yeah.
Two stream of consciousness, so it's very Keynesian in economics, where demand is the key, and supply sort of follows demand around, it reacts to demand in some sense. I guess that rings a bell. The other thing is, so there's no feedback loop in traditional lean way of thinking about things.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. It comes
I don't
up.
want to jump ahead. Then.
Yeah, it will appear.
Okay.
What I'm trying to do is build up very fundamentally, piece by piece.
Okay.
So, the third premise, so the value add signaled by the recipient may not match the energies provided that the provider has invested, or the production factors the provider has invested to deliver these goods and services. So I put in this amount to do this thing. If it's excess, above the value add is waste and should be eliminated. Any gap between, so basically, and let's just use dollars because it's easy. If the recipient says $100 is my value, right? And the provider says, well, we sell it for $200. Whatever it costs them above $100 is waste, right? And should be eliminated. They need to find a way to eliminate that to get it down. Any gap between the current value add and the minimum value required by the recipient is also waste, and the gap should be closed. So if the consumer says, I need $100 of value, and the provider can only provide $80 of value, right? They can't even meet the minimum. They have to close that gap, and that gap is waste. Otherwise, the entire $80 is waste, and you need to eliminate the entire $80 of effort. Any gap between the current value and the minimum value on a public benefit, however, must be closed. There's no option to just eliminate the entire thing. So if there's a safety rule that says you must be delivering $100 worth of safety and you're not even meeting the minimum, you have to close it.
Seems like the one variable that's missing here is time.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. We're right now just defining. So if you're above it, you're coming down towards it. If you're beneath it, you're rising up to it. So the goal of eliminating waste is not to reach a minimum, but you're actually closing the distance to value and at the rate of this external pull.
Okay. Is pull the provider's rate of delivery, or is that
The recipient's rate of accepting.
Okay, so that's a demand rate.
Yeah, it's a demand signal.
Not a delivery rate. Okay.
And the range wherein the provider can meet this delivery within the value add with a sufficient buffer in slack or profit that maintains operations even while adapting to changes in pull over time without dipping beneath that minimum or creating excessive waste is termed flow. So now we have over time changes by the customer that says we want more, we want less, our values have changed. The ability to adapt on that over time and stick within that buffer is termed flow. Okay. Following so far? Okay. Given the four previous premises, recipients define value, to providers this is value add, recipients determine pull, energies invested that do not match are waste and should be eliminated unless it's the gap to the minimum value of a public good. Responding to change in recipients with pull without adding waste is flow over time. Lean theory must subsume all the behavioral and technical elements of the providers, recipients, and environment in which they exist, including the public benefits. The interactions over time between these parts with feedback emerges a system which must be considered as a whole, and this is termed systems thinking. So now lean theory says in order to do this, you can't just consider any one part in isolated because you have to be effective over time, and what effective is defined by is this entire interacting moving system.
So where have you ventured beyond the realms of prior lean practice? Is this the last bullet sort of a step beyond that now?
No, this is actually, so system, every ending term, value add, pull, waste, flow, and systems thinking is a fundamental lean term that you would probably get from people to say that's a core principle of lean, but it's never been sort of defined as to how it exists, how it comes into being, why it exists, how does it relate to one another, why you should do it. And this is trying to say this is how it emerges, why it emerges, how they relate, and what they do.
But they're already using systems thinking as a terminology?
It's in, I have a whole video on this, the missing link. It's in all the literature and it's never defined. And my theory is that the Repenning guys and the MIT Bubbas were sitting side by side with Womack and like pigs and chickens in a barn. It hopped over from the system dynamics and system thinking's guy. And they looked at lean and said, that looks like they're using system thinking. And then they just parted. And lean forever went one way with this term that they had no idea what to apply, because the general definition of systems thinking in lean is think systemically, think holistically, think of the whole, think, and that's it. I mean, they don't really have much in the way. And system dynamics, of course, and systems thinking went off this way and didn't really go back to lean. And I'm connected with Michael Ball, who's a lean writer who was a system dynamicist who left system dynamics to go to lean because he saw in lean a lot of system stuff. And I'm a lean guy who left lean to go to system dynamics because I wanted to be able to explain lean. I mean, so you see these back and forth, but there's this huge gap between the two, which I think could be resolved.
So, do I understand then that there are the notion of standards that have been developed for lean, or not?
There's the standards generally exist within the concept of a lean Six Sigma. So within a Six Sigma, and most lean practitioners frown on those.
Okay, so I was wondering if there's like an authority or
American quality of quality improvement, it's kind of like a process improvement engineer. It's a society. A society has set some standards for what a black belt should know, and they have systems thinking. They have every single one of these terms in there, but they have systems thinking, and it's never defined. It's just a check mark, and it's in the black belt certification standards that a black belt must know how to do systems thinking.
Whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And there's definitions out there of what flow and pull and waste and all these things are. And waste, there's the 8 wastes of Muda, the waste of Murray, and there's definitions out there, but there's never a description. It always starts with what are the 8 wastes of Muda.
Mm-hmm. I can see still a fuzzy boundary between systems thinking and system dynamics, right?
I didn't realize it was controversial until I started picking that scab.
Yeah, I mean,
to me, it seems natural that system dynamics, and maybe it's just the benefit of coming in a generation later, is system dynamics is the structural approach and dictionary in the language, and systems thinking is what helps infuse, but it really is, I guess, 2 maybe different ways. I don't know.
Well, all system dynamicists are systems thinkers, but not all systems thinkers are system dynamicists.
Right.
So they don't write equations.
Are you talking?
Yeah, started at 1.
I thought it was 2 o'clock.
Nope, 1 o'clock.
I thought it was at noon. So I was way early.
With 2 economists, we can average the difference and hit it up.
Right.
Yeah. Can we join the party?
On average,
Yeah,
we're right at time.
I just got it wrong.
Yeah. So, no, I mean, so that's a good point, that all system dynamicists are system thinkers and all not all. Okay, that makes sense. So this is the theory, but it's got to be falsifiable, it's got to be testable. And how do you do that? Because this is very vague and obviously needs revision, is this is not a complete list. In theory, though, if you're doing these things, you should have increased throughput, higher morale, increased market share, innovation, reputation, higher quality, with no burden shifting, right? These are things that lean, you go around and you sort of say you do these things and these things happen, and it shouldn't be because you saved a bunch of money, but your employee morale goes in the tank and you lose a bunch of employees and the quality goes in the toilet and your market share goes down. That's burden shifting, right? So I got to work on the definitions of these, but some of the tests should be if you apply a lean concept, you should see one of these things appear without some other effect appearing elsewhere that's sort of a burden shift.
You're going to need a multivariate sort of scoring function or scoring metric so you can grade or rank simulation runs, saying, given all of these various things we're going to worry about, on net, what happens when we try this or that policy change or structural change?
The independent tool I'm thinking of as a measure is the project dynamics model, because that's independent, someone else built it, it's synthetic, it's through that, and add modules to it that represent elements of lean theory and say, does it produce this? And then you do the runs and you might be able to do a multivariate. Or empirical results testing says, does this produce that benefit? Does that make sense?
Actually, Mike brought that up. Interesting point. There's I'm trying to remember the acronym now. And I've seen a few papers that blend system dynamics and multi-criteria decision analysis.
Andy Ford's done a lot with that.
Okay, that's right.
And it goes back to Daniel McFadden, Nobel Prize winner in economics, discrete choice literature.
Right.
What's his name on it?
Isn't McFadden one of the 2?
George Backus has done a lot.
Okay.
Isn't McFadden one of the 2 that you were talking to Saeed about, the developmental?
Possibly. He's a Nobel laureate, so he comes up a lot.
Yeah, I think.
And David Anderson and George Richardson have done a few things at Albany over the years.
Right. So that might be.
So there are ways, there are techniques for smearing all that stuff into one sort of number at the end, where you can say, all right, the simulation run that gave us the highest value, given it's taken all this stuff into account from a systems perspective, is.
Because what I'm already finding is that a lot of the tools actually represent the same fundamental structure. I'm hoping I'm finding some of the tools never produce a benefit. Because in practice, I've seen things that get tagged along and saying, do this in lean. I don't think it ever produces a benefit, but it says do this in lean because it's always been done. It gets passed along as sort of lore. And I'd like to be able to cut some of that stuff out and say, this stuff never works. Don't do it. or this stuff really works, do this first, or this stuff only works after doing this. You know, some of those things I'm hoping to tease out from this process, but multivariate or multi-decision criteria.
Yeah.
The screen choice thing. There's a whole bunch of stuff that these guys that we can provide you citations.
Yeah, I mean, this is a sidebar. I mean, theory's been used here in several places, but at some point, you have to pose a hypothesis or hypotheses, right, that have to be tested. I'm jumping ahead now.
Yes,
I think, okay.
You're actually right into. So that's the theory. How do we display this theory, right? For each module of the lean theory, the validity process, the process of building validity in that element, should have a plain language definition of the concept, a logical definition derived from the plain language, expressed both in writing, and then a causal loop diagram. The translation of the causal loop into a simple stock and flow with characteristics of what we might call, you know, the vividly descriptive models, the exploratory models, the obvious parameters, causal assumptions are evident, behavior tied to model structure. The parameter test is created as real-world scenarios, very Forrester kind of stuff in this. But then representative behaviors produced by the model tied to the structure, and then the results of empirical or synthetic simulation testing indicating it creates one or more of the provider benefits, some sort of hypothesis testing. Does this structure, when added to an existing known independent simulation, create a change that we can test and verify? When we go out, if we go out and do an empirical study, does it create the change? Something that is then scientifically testable, even if it's scientifically testable in a synthetic data set, does it create the change that we're expecting? Because if it doesn't create the change in a synthetic simulation, it probably won't create the change in the real world. It's probably incapable of creating the change. And my suspicion is there's some things which are simply incapable of doing what they claim to do, and others are more than capable of doing it and probably carried along some of those other things.
By the way, it's, I want to argue that, or question whether the CLD actually has to be a part of this. Because it's sort of anti-Forrester in a way, right?
Yeah, Jay would say.
Well, they go to stocks.
Jay would say, look at any of my publications, find me a causal loop.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, well, I think the Forrester part is the middle dashes, but I think the causal loop diagram, I merge these two together. I think the causal
So
loop
nothing
diagram
wrong with
yeah.
using CLD, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But,
My suggestion is that the causal loop diagram contains all your modules. So within each module, there is a stock and flow diagram and the information links connecting them together. When you pick these various hypotheses, put them into one
Causal
loop, that's where it will be most useful.
Right. So not of the individual modules, which are going to be super. Because I was wondering.
There's simple stock and flow structures.
Okay.
But when you connect them together, and in fact, if you use the new Stella architect, you can create a module for each, and it'll create that causal diagram.
I was wondering about that because the causal loop at the first module, because I've created one just as a test and run this through and see what happens, was very simple. I mean, it's a ridiculously simple stock causal loop diagram, so it doesn't really provide much value. What you're saying is wait until you've got multiple modules, then link them together in a causal loop.
Yeah, I mean, as a communications device, though, the thing that, as we've seen in various places, CLDs can be ambiguous, right? So it's like there's a hazard, I think, of over relying on it as a communications device because there are ambiguities in CLDs.
Right.
So it may enlighten things, but on other occasions it may sort of fog over.
I'm not sure if it's between other things. It's sort of like the multiple things here is sort of though. My question is you do it plain language, CLD, stock and flow. Does the stock and flow create ambiguities without the CLD?
No, the stock and flow is for the various hypotheses
To test
which are integrating. And CLD is the overall structure connecting those together. Like you have a rework cycle,
Yeah.
and you have some other structure up there, because
I guess maybe I'm thinking of with the thesis I did for the master's, I did have a complete causal loop, and that led me to the premises, which I tested as hypotheses in the stock and flow. Because I was like, if this thing is true, this logic, there's 9 things that have to exist. And then I tested it. But if I'm building it up now piece by piece, it may be I'm building up the stock and flows, and I won't have those until I'll have the individual premises, but not.
Well, the stock and flow is first, and the CLE is derived from it.
Well,
then you don't have the same.
Well, no.
You say it's not the same ordering in terms of that.
But that's what I'm saying is usually I do causal loop diagrams first, and then use those to build the stock and flow. And
that's the standard methods involved, right? That
well,
or others.
I'm not using the standard method. I'm trying to describe the method that I would be using here.
Okay.
But I could pull it out.
So let me switch gears to some work I did many, many years ago. But I think it's relevant here to something I think. And let's switch gears and start talking about philosophy of science. Okay, so years ago, when I was a graduate student, I took a mandatory class, which I'm glad I did, but when I was assigned to take it, I had no idea what the hell it was, so all right, I have to take it. And we were sitting in a room like this, but it was a much bigger conference table, and all the graduate students are, before the professor comes in the first day, and there's a table at the front of the room with a little lectern on it, and he was carrying a whole big, huge pile of books and stuff. And we're all, and he just goes, boom, and he drops it and goes, bang, on the table. Everybody looks up, and he goes, how do you know if an explanation for something is true? Right. First words out of the guy's mouth, doesn't even introduce himself. Everybody stops and is like, tell us who you are and head out the syllabus before we start in, right? And I was like, that's a damn fine question. How do you know if an explanation for something is true? Well, it was a whole class on economic methodology. How do economists explain things? How do scientists explain things? How do philosophers think about explanations in science and so forth? It's a fascinating course. I'd known none of it before I took the course. It was all absolutely new to me, right? So there's an age-old debate going back to Descartes versus Hume. Deductive logic versus inductive logic to explain things. And there's a million nuances on this, but we're doing right. There's all the Popperian and all the various the Vienna Circle and on it goes. But in a nutshell, either you do what Descartes said, and you start by using logic. You start with the mind. You start with math, and you lay out a theory, a logical theory. Yes. And from it, you derive testable hypotheses. Then and only then do you look at the real world, which, because it can be misleading if you read Plato's Republic and he talks about his cave and you're being misled by the shadows on the wall and what have you. And then if the real world data, it either confirms or adds support to your theory, or it does not. Hume, on the other hand, said that's exactly wrong. It should be the opposite way. You start by looking at the real world and making observations, and if you find generalities or patterns, you accumulate them. And they were called, so in the Humean world, you start by doing pattern modeling. You look for patterns. And you're looking for patterns like a detective at the scene of a crime. Right. You're trying to piece together what the heck is going on here. You're using a systems approach. There's puzzle pieces. You're taking various bits of information and trying to form an explanation of what the heck happened here. If you find regularities, you assemble those in real typologies. And then if there's regularities among the real typologies, those are principles of systems. Okay, that's the inductive or Hume approach. And then the detective uses his or her knowledge of real types and principles of systems for the next case, for the next crime scene. So, for example, it might be that the crime is a speculative bubble in the housing market, and you produce an explanation of why it happened. But then you put that up here and you say, wow, but there's been a speculative bubble in the .com stock market in the 2000, 2001. There was a speculative bubble in tulip bulbs in the 1700s and whatever. And so you can make, sort of a generic model of a speculative bubble,
And then in that, you might find regularities. And so the economists would say, the heterodox economists use this approach. They would say, well, the most important principle of economic systems is circular and cumulative causation. And that goes back to Beard and some other folks. So whereas if you're Descartes, you say Keynes came up with the notion of a consumption function. And he tells you in the general theory, it's from logic, it's from common sense, that the household sector spending is essentially like this. And then you can go out and econometrically get data here and get data here and estimate this. This has to be greater than 0. And when you use time series data, it's not.
Right. So
it doesn't confirm Keynes's theory, but cross-sectional data does. But you start with the theory and you derive testable, econometrically estimable equations. Very different approaches to explaining or doing science, right? I argued system dynamics models are pattern models. That's exactly, and then the most important principle in economics among economists who've never heard of system dynamics is circular and cumulative causation. Sounds like stocks and flows and feedback loops to me. So if you're trying to do, using the traditional tools of system dynamics, sort of a theory of lean, you're talking, or the conversation has been over here, but it seems to me you should be over here.
Well, see,
I could be wrong.
This is a great conversation because and I hate to say this, the best thing I got out of your agent-based modeling class was the paper about generative theory, which was one of the papers you...
Epstein,
yeah, where he talks about modeling is now both deductive and inferential, that you have to, there's some deduction of how you build a model structure, but then you're running it and you're learning inferences and you're using those inferences in generations to build theory. So
this might be a little stark. It could be
right. So it's that's sort of where my head's at, is somewhere between that paper, that single paper has informed my thinking, probably wrong, and what Professor Said is talking about, validity and building validity. Between those two is sort of where my head's at, and sort of how you build theory, and from the debate of, can you make social science axiomatic like in a Keynes? I absolutely don't believe, but it's sort of more of, is there a collection of principles within a model that you can test and say this is validity and stuff like that? I'm sort of falling to that, which in the last presentation, it was described as semantic theory. That's sort of like rather than syntactic, but that may be, maybe that's not, I don't know if that falls on the left or the right, but it's more with semantic, you build a model included within which are many, many testable things. And no one single thing is right or wrong, but the collection of them in the model kind of gives us more confidence. So I guess it's more on the left because it's more of the
certainly that's the Forster and Senge approach.
The only reason I go for the right, at least in this, is to me it was to build the layers up, at least to because there's this ton of, I'm not really feeling like I'm being deductive because there's all this, I have to be inferential. I spent 20 years in this. There's no way I can sort of tabula rasa, clean my mind, and sort of I'm building from what I've already known. And sort of, and to me, I have to be building from lean experience because it's not, I'm not sitting here magically thinking without any experience in it. So to me, it's somewhat inferential and just going away to the crud and sort of saying, what's the fundamental?
Based on what you were saying, though, is I was thinking like the pattern model would be the next time you parachute into an organization to do some lean stuff.
Oh yeah, it's all parables.
Acme company.
Yeah.
And you're guided by your knowledge of this stuff.
I can usually tell in 15 minutes what they need.
But you'd have all sorts of a catalog on your computer, if you will, of case studies and a generic structure from those case studies, if you will, of lean interventions or something. And I don't know if it's a single one or a family of them or whatever, who knows. And then, of course, the similarities there are stocks, flows, feedback loops, molecules, whatever. I mean, I haven't thought, But then you're using knowledge of that stuff and this to do the next lean study, right? And you're ferreting out the salient at each level, the most salient, generalizable insights.
I got induced to write a textbook on my method of lean in 2006 because my method was very, very different from everyone else because I was trained by manufacturing but went into knowledge base in like 1994, which was very early to do that. We were trained by the Boeing folks and we went into sort of knowledge base, and I translated all the manufacturing theories of lean into different areas. So for me, it was natural. In 2006, I stopped writing it though because I had no way to explain feedback. if you go back and read these, you can see I'm struggling with concepts of feedback. I'm like, you can tell, I don't have the language, so I just kind of stopped writing it because I couldn't adequately explain it. I think, though, that is kind of sort of where I'm going, but my question is, how do I break away from the crud that has built up to say, this is how you build into these concepts and get to this, how does flow exist? It doesn't just emerge from somewhere, it comes from this. How does pull exist? It has to come from somewhere. So maybe that's why it looks deductive. It's sort of building it up step by step so that people can understand.
Well, actually, those concepts are fragments which exist out there.
Yeah.
And the process of assembling them is inductive.
I think that's,
Because I can't claim I've created any of the terms.
That's why constructing feedbacks which arise out of that assembly, that's the inductive process. That's what you want to construct.
And that's the thing is these terms are not anything I've created. All I've done is sort of created a way of putting them together to get to a point of saying this is the theory, which is, to me, it was surprising there was no theory.
I think that's an inductive process. That's an important contribution. The fragments exist out there. Like in economic theory also, there are many fragments, and in product system dynamics models, we try to assemble those fragments together to build a more comprehensive theory.
Homer's worker burnout model, he found fragments in all the management literature, the psych literature, the military science literature, and he was able to pull them together and see which ones were silly, which ones were logically coherent, whatever, to come up with them.
And I think the reason this is resisted theory, I mean, Six Sigma's theory is statistics. It's very easy. I mean, it's there. But I think the reason this has resisted theory is because of this last premise that it's a system. And if you don't have the language of system, if you don't have, in all the literature reviews, they talked about system is important, but we can't do mathematical simulation, so we'll ignore it. Or system thinking is really important, but you can't model qualitative people behavior, so we're going to ignore it. This part has stymied, I think, lean to an extent. It hasn't Six Sigma, because Six Sigma is just about the math. They kind of just quantify it down to the numbers. So, go ahead.
Or just actually draw a line and say, just create a break between what you're doing and Lean. Because Lean's coming with its own baggage train, right? Of practices and all the consultant branding and everything.
Yeah.
So what you're doing is going to be something beyond that, or in addition to that.
I would say this. Jay Forrester wrote a book called Principles of Systems, right, where he tried to sort of codify. I don't think Jay was thinking about it quite in this manner, but essentially he was working up here to try and lay out the fundamental ideas when you're doing system dynamics modeling. Right? Over here would be a generic model of something, of project management or of lean, let's say. And then over here would be, you're going to do the next lean intervention at Acme Corporation. And the argument, I suppose, would be, if you know this, whatever the current rendition, if you were to rewrite Jay's book, what's in current modern times, what are the principles of systems? Flows connect to stocks.
Yeah.
Feedback links originate at stocks and feedback to flow, all these sorts of principles. And you're familiar with the generic structure or structures that you come up with. Maybe there's a family of them, I'm not sure. Then, using information on both of those, somebody could do the next lean intervention, at least as you would feel is a best practice coming from your dissertation.
Right. That's kind of
my friend is right. If that conflicts with something, some consultant somewhere says, so what?
And that's kind of where I want to get to conflict to the consultant, because there's a lot of consultants out there doing like hedge surgery, like leeches and stuff. But I didn't want to close one thing. If causal loop diagrams create ambiguity, I absolutely want to remove them. I don't want to remove it just because it's not in the right SD method, but if it creates confusion, I do want to remove them. That's the sort of the guideline for me. But
there's the famous Richardson table problems with causal loop diagram. So as long as you are aware of where they can lead folks astray and don't fall into those traps.
But I also see the value.
Actually, those problems that Richardson pointed out occur when you directly translate everything in a stock and flow diagram to a causal diagram. The type of causal diagram that I'm suggesting are at a higher level. They connect connect those modules together. And there's no problem with Windows.
I think that's correct.
And I think this is the nice balance, because right now the causal loop diagram is a one-for-one because it's simple. But if I make it at the modules, how the modules flow together, that will give you a picture of lean at the principle level, how the principles work together.
The way I teach it in 550 is at the sector diagram.
Yeah, the module level, yeah.
Conceptual helicopter.
I think that's good. So be it resolved, CLDs are out at this level, because at the module level, it didn't add value here. And I think it's good to show real quick. I did go through, so this
that would be one module.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, I wanted to propose, because part of this theory is to say, or principles is to say, this is how going forward people should create. There's tons of things out there. Well, if you want to create a module in the lean body of knowledge or theory, my proposal is do it this way, and you can challenge or improve my way of doing it, but at least here's a start, so that you could have something that other people could say, oh, I think A3 should be tested this way. And I was, I had this on the board for a while, so I identified 10 ones that are very common. I may do 4 or 5 in the first paper or something, and I've gone through and done one, which is absolutely the most common. So I went through all those steps. The plain language of waste growth to buffer function is work expands so as to fill the time available over its completion, Parkinson's law. We don't have enough kitchen space, so we fill up closets, then we fill garages, then we fill sheds, then we build, we rent storage space. It's not a problem of space. It's not that we don't have enough space, it's we have too much space. And this fundamental piece of lean is that any activity expands to the space we give it, almost naturally. So a recipient only wants what is valuable, and they're outside the organization. So anything, if their definition of value, if there's any buffer above their definition of value, whatever goes to that buffer above is by definition waste. Removing that buffer, putting a limit on it, gradually decline it, the hypothesis, should increase the percent of value relative, or at least keep it from getting worse. So this is now kind of a plain language testable. And maybe this isn't plain enough. I don't know how plain it needs to be.
The other thing, just to make sure we all understand, I suppose, if that's the way to say it, is if you look at the famous Forrester and Senge paper on building confidence in system dynamics models, if you look at Dave Peterson's PhD thesis, if you look at, there's a chapter in Sturman, they all essentially say the same thing. They talk a ton about, multiple points of contact with the real world in your model, the robustness of models, not putting in fudge factors in your models and what have you. So even if you think about it in the inductive manner, there are multiple ways to test your hypothesis, if you will, so it conforms with the real world. So I think, following a traditional system dynamics approach properly done, there's a whole lot of checkpoints with reality that we go through. You don't have to run t-tests and stuff like that. Right?
So proceeding to the formal definition is waste grows at a rate that is a function of its current size and the buffer within which it has room to grow. That function I'm proposing is an S-curve because I think it's a marginal cost of adding waste. When the buffer is almost empty or full, it's harder to add waste. If it's empty, we think harder about what we're going to put in. When there's stuff in there, we think less hard because there's already in. When it's almost full, we think very carefully we're going to cram the last thing. So it's an S-curve. The growth is only limited by the boundary of the buffer itself. All else being equal, we place the limiters at kind of what I just said. The value should go up. Very useless causal loop diagram will be being removed. It's a balancing loop, right?
When you say function there, you mean that this is like a value function, right?
No, well, that's the graphical function.
Well, I mean, but it's what the ordinate is value.
No, well, the function is the rate at which waste will grow.
Oh, okay.
That's the rate of growth.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So waste grows at a rate that is a function of its current size.
Okay.
And this comes from one of the generic rules of Professor Said, assuming I did it correctly.
Okay.
Any errors I will take.
That translates to value, which is
Value
will be marginally flattened out as you get to.
Correct.
Right.
So this is the and I'll jump to the model here, but this is basically the stock and flow. You got a stock of waste, a stock of value add. Again, this is from the perception of whatever's in here is defined by the recipient, so the person in the organization can't determine this, but these two combined are the total product. And the percent of value is simply, obviously, this divided into this. The waste, there's a buffer allowed, the buffer remaining, it's a simple adjustment. The S curve is over here, hidden currently, but the effective remaining buffer of waste, you see that there's a feedback here that the more waste you have, it's actually a multiple of the waste times the function, and then the time for it to grow or decline. How long does it take?
I would think there ought to be a connector between waste and the flow feeding value add.
Why?
Well, I mean, at some point, as the value is going to, the value add is going to flatline at some point as a function of the waste, right?
Except that, as I understand, Tim is trying to articulate the theory that already exists, or a fragment of the theory.
Right.
Now, in that theory, is there a connection between waste and change in value add?
No. Value add is determined by the customer. So if you have 100 widgets in your product and the customer says, the characteristics I like are represented by 80 widgets, unless you design more benefits in it, you change it to attributes they like, it's got 80 widgets of benefit in it, and 80 widgets of value. That's the value add. Now, you may produce it for 80 widgets, 100 widgets, 120 widgets. The value that they get out of it is only represented by 80 widgets. The only way to change that is to add more things that they like, that they define, that's outside.
Okay, so that's drawing a distinction between, say, the market value and net value, right? Because there's the market value of widgets, but then there's the net value once you've added in the cost of production and all that kind of stuff. Right?
Value is, don't think of value as just a dollar term. Think of value as the representation of utility.
I was going to say, we would say, in economics, we would say widgets, because a widget is a thing. We'd say utils.
Utils, I may put in utils, but I'm trying to think of what waste is utils maybe, or something that represents, because it's the combination of, when you look at lean, you say your process is 20% non-value add, 80% non-value add, 20% value add. That means everything you do, 20% of what you're doing actually adds value. 80% is waste. That's the area of target that you have to reduce. And that value add, it may be wait time, so there's no cost associated with it. There's no labor. It may be labor time, which you can reduce. It's not necessarily value from a market standpoint.
In a way, what Fred is saying makes some sense. If the customer, for example, perceives a value add sort of a target.
Right.
And then in the company, there is a value add which actually exists, and the change is the discrepancy that adjusts towards the target. Is that what you?
But that would be.
Yeah. Right.
But that is not. That change is not a function of the buffer that the waste can grow within. That change comes from some other causal activity. Because
it comes from the discrepancy between what the customer perceives as what the value add should be and the actual value that the company is producing.
But that activity is not being modeled here. If I have too much stuff in my kitchen, adding more stuff doesn't necessarily add more value. It doesn't automatically happen.
I mean, I think he's raising an interesting point there. There's a perception of value, and then there's the real value.
Yes.
Right. So the question is, whose perspective is it? Is it the recipient's value perception?
Always, this goes back to the definition. The value is always defined by the person outside the organization.
So in fact,
and that's why
that outside person is not thinking of a change, but perceiving how much the value should be.
Well, but this is why I said
the change is driven by the discrepancy.
But this is why I said all else being equal, because I'm actually focusing on how waste grows. not how value changes. Does that make sense? Because there's no requirement for value to change in this model. It simply exists as, it could be a static, it could be a constant.
You start with, say, 0, or
it starts with a, let's see, I can do a,
if it's equilibrium, say it starts with 0, and change in waste is also 0, and then
I'm using the wrong mouse. It's a problem.
so if you step up the change in value added from 0 to something.
So small. This is, I used, I think sort of to your point, this is percent of value, right? And as what I did was, as the waste grows, your percent of value drops. And this is the percent of everything you spend, your total product, what percent of it's of this value. So as your has more and more waste in your product, the percent that's actually value drops.
As Microsoft Word gets more and more complicated with features that nobody uses.
Right, the percent that is value drops. And so all of them have the same. There's 3 runs. And then the 2 tests were, you introduce a limit to say we're no longer increasing, and that limit in a warehouse could be we're cutting off this space, we're no longer putting anything, it's a whip limit, whip cap. You hear that. They will be in a budget. We're taking away your budget. We're no longer allowing more budget. We're going to hard stop the budget. You see a lot of these limits. Or continual reduction, right? We're going to continually take away the buffer, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And what it shows here, just very, again, extremely simple, is that the waste stops, obviously, when the buffer limit is met, and the continual reduction over time starts out a little slower and ends up curving back and eventually crossing the limit. Super simple, super, super simple at the module level. It seems almost too simple, but it's never been shown at this level of simplicity. And that's the hard part, is that people don't get this. Yeah.
Go back to your stock and flow diagram. Now, if you started this in equilibrium, the change in value add would be 0, I would assume.
Yes.
And change in waste will be 0 too.
Right.
Now, what happens when you stepped up change in value add?
So the percent of value would increase. The only way to change, so if it was an
I
equal,
would say that value add will grow.
percent of value
I
would
mean,
increase.
it will be like a ramp.
Right, because I mean, if we're increasing value, it would have to model customers perceiving more value that they didn't realize before, design and innovation, elements that are not.
I'm just looking at the mechanics.
Yeah.
If change in value add goes from 0 to, let's say, 0.1, then the stock will grow like a ramp. Value add stock will grow like a ramp indefinitely.
Okay.
And that would mean that, what is that?
Percent value.
Percent value will also grow.
Yep.
And
But waste has nothing, there's no link to it.
there is waste actually is not connected to the stock.
Right.
Waste is not connected to value add stock. So nothing happens to that.
Right, which means your percent of value would increase until it hit 1, 100, or approaching 1.
No, it will go beyond that.
If
It's unbounded.
It's unbounded.
The value add would have, like, take the example of Microsoft Word. Features in Microsoft Word would have like a maximum value for that stock. And as the number of features is added, we do more things with it, the value add starts to grow until that maximum value is reached as defined by the user. And if Microsoft keeps adding features beyond that, all you're going to do is add waste.
I could add I could make value add a constant and not a stock, or I could add a maximum value add, or simply add a change in value add that controls and set it to 0. But it would never be unbounded because the actual percent value is a percent of the total product.
So you can do that easily, coming back to the original question that Fred raised. If there is a perception of value on customer's part,
Right.
and the change depends on the frequency. If that perception goes up, the value add will adjust towards that perception. still the waste system is not connected to the value add at all, and I don't know why that is.
Because the entire purpose of the model was to look at this side. The waste growth, the buffer.
Right. But what I'm saying is that if the value add goes up, nothing happens to the waste system.
Because it doesn't, to me at least, it doesn't necessarily follow that if you add more value, you create waste. Just like it doesn't follow that if you add more waste, you create more value. The two do not necessarily value accepted.
What does the theory say?
But
The theory says that
isn't waste? Isn't the increase in waste a value subtraction in the total sense? I mean, if you draw the boundary to include all costs of production, and
let me answer his first. Value is defined by the recipients. So the only way to add value is to get their buy-in to do it, right? But recipients don't add production costs or things like that. Only the providers can. Anything they provide that is not in that value add goes to waste. So they are dislinked.
Okay, let's go back to the stock and flow that.
Okay.
Now, the recipient, I would say that there is a variable out there,
Right.
which is, let's say, value,
Recipient value
recipient value,
or max value or something.
or customer value.
and customer value. And the value add there is within the company. Value add, that stock is within the company.
Right. This is the value add part of the total product.
And it's attempting to, the company is attempting to adjust to the recipient perceived value. And that's why the change comes in. It's changing its value add.
That wasn't the purpose of this model, though. The purpose of this model was simply to show, very simply, that the buffer itself is why waste grows. And I'm wondering if there's.
It's not connected to value add at all.
No. It was simply, I mean, literally we're almost at a molecule level, and I'm wondering if I should have made value add constant. Because there may be another module about increasing the.
One thing that's sort of confusing to me is that in that model, there's two domains. There's the customer domain and there's the provider domain.
Right. So
you have to make clear which is which and what's driving which.
Right, because the ultimate value is determined by the customer, but this module, the only way, I guess, the reason I put in value add at all was to understand that by capping your buffer or decreasing it over time, the hypothesis is you will increase the percent of value that you have. So you have to have some notion of what value is to show that. And it's a very simplistic hypothesis.
Let's go back to your diagram. And supposing instead of this value add stock, you just had a constant.
Right, that's.
And then you change something on the waste side, let's say change in waste. If there is something down further below.
Oh, yeah, these are just the ramp switch to
Ramp switch.
continuous improvement is
Is productivity, the notion of productivity is possible?
no, this is solely the buffer. Now,
So supposing you increase the buffer allowed for waste.
right,
That would increase the waste.
yep,
And that would change the percentage value, right? We would reduce the
we would
percentage
reduce,
value.
yeah, so we can run that test. So we call this increased buffer. So this is what happens when you hire a new CEO who decides the best way to solve things is to buy new versions of Microsoft. And we say, where's the buffer? Buffer allowed for waste is.
This is sort of like the inventory management problem, right? In terms of
Right, and so you increase the buffer to 150.
You have to maintain to.
So I think what we are getting at is that this stock, value add stock, does not belong here.
The only reason it exists is as a module. These are intended to plop in and connect to other things.
This should be a separate module.
But you need, so you need an input of value to understand the percent value add, and it would come from somewhere else in the model. You're right. So this, and you can see here, by the way, the increased buffer, it does come back and end up lower than the other ones. By increasing the buffer, you did lower the percent of value, which is the hypothesis. Again, it's self-evident. I mean, it's not rocket science. But the main thing is, if this is a module that I'm hoping people would drop into different simulations, you need to have some knowledge, and I could put it as a constant for now, and in another module it would.
Then let it come from other module.
Right.
Or as a constant.
Okay. And then somehow explain to them, replace this with the input from, because the creation of value add has to do with innovation, has to do with marketing. You can create value add by marketing someone, and then the recipient goes, oh, I do need a different colored iPod. I have defined the benefit now to be green, and all of a sudden Apple stock goes up. I mean, that does work that way, but this is sort of to really get to the simple.
Yeah, you need a separate module. It's just
this
is value creation module. Right?
But what's interesting is with this simple, and I will change this to a constant. So with something this simple, it would actually be able to replicate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different lean tools that I've found so far, which means that lean has incredible overlap. There's of the 8 wastes, 2 of them can be replicated with just the simple structure of 5S, which has 5 things you do. You have to have the structure to be able to replicate while you do the 4th and the 5th one. For Kanbans, when you get to Kanbans have multiple things you can layer in, type 1 through 6. Type 1 and 5, you need this. I mean, there's a lot of things in lean that would need this structure and might simplify to a great deal by this one module. Just this concept of buffer, waste growth to buffer. I think the rework loop will have like 20, just because it's so fundamental, and lean has had so many ways of defining it in different ways, that the rework module, which is the next one, I'm going to be like, hey, cool, Cooper or Linus, cite them, put it in this, done, simple, stock, rework loop, very simple. It's going to probably knock out a whole bunch of stuff. And my hope with these modules is they start doing that and subsuming in many of the lean things.
Sounds like there's some redundancies in the heuristics of lean.
I'm hoping that's the one I'm hoping to find, or that things are falsifiable that say this thing you've always included in the 8 wastes or the A3 or the 5 this or the 2 that or the humana are not needed, and you're spending all this time to teach people and train them and build materials and put up posters and train and certify.
If you find leverage points in your model,
exactly,
then you can say to the consultant world or wherever, here's where a little bit of effort gives you a big change.
And the rework loop, one of the things here this is what's missing off the project dynamics. This is the first thing that I came to and drew on the whiteboard. Is project dynamics never looks at whether there's a distinction between value add and waste of the input to the product. It assumes everything's value add. So if this total product, imagine this ends up being your work to do, is your 100 that you start as your work to do in the project. Well, if 80 of it is waste and 20 of it is value add, or because it's construction, it's 90 value add and 10 waste. Well, what happens if you reduce 5 waste and you're now at 95 and all those rework loops are now 5 less? Is that a big change? I don't know. I haven't attached this to the project, or is it just a parameter and it's not really on a feedback loop, so it doesn't have much effect.
It sounds like a lot of this should have been covered in some of the SD modeling's been done for supply chain work with inventories included.
It may have been, but I didn't find it. I looked in lean system dynamics. There's only like 3 or 4 models out there, and they're very, very ad hoc. It's a polite way to put it.
I'll get a chance. I'll tool through some of my stuff.
And if there's stuff out there that's already done, like I think Professor Said sort of did, I'm not looking to reinvent the wheel. If someone's done it, vetted, well described, I'm using his generic rules, I'm going to cite Linus's model for rework loops. If someone's already got
Ed Roberts is probably the origin.
Oh, Ed Roberts, okay, yeah. But I mean, I'm going to cite the origin,
Robert Reebok cited
Roberts, my bad.
Invented it.
So if there is something that separates, but the key is it separates waste and value add in this lean way. Because a lot of cases, once you get outside of lean, the distinctions become fuzzy.
Yeah, because the whole notion of like just-in-time manufacturing and that kind of stuff gets into exactly how to do supply chain analysis.
Right.
Really tight inventories.
And just-in-time has some flaws that get exposed when there's a shock like an earthquake, or as we get more fast turning, when you get fast turning, which is where this concept of a buffer, a sufficient buffer to maintain without going under or over of flow is now, that's the tricky part, right? It's somewhat easy these days to have just-in-time with no buffer, and then you have a change in your stock out, you know? It's easy to have high buffer and no buffer. The challenge is to mix and match, and that's the lean trick.
I'm surprised in the lean literature, if I'm understanding you correctly, there's an assumption that the organization can't shape values or what
they
the customer
can.
through marketing and so on.
They absolutely can, but what they're saying is until the customer recognizes that value, you can't assume its value. They basically don't want the managers. The big thing in lean, especially coming from the classic lean, is you don't want managers justifying their own value, or it becomes a self-licking ice cream cone. Anything they decide, my new program, my new initiative, my new technology is value add because I think it is for the customers, and that's how waste develops. So they are very rigorous in saying, what do the customers actually say? Now, if they could market and the customers reflect back and say, yes, we do like this new style of car, we expect, I mean, there's a Kano analysis is actually, they use a lot, the Kano analysis of, I'm excited about this, I expect this, and I'm turned off if they don't have it. So they market things that are exciters, and then those eventually shift to expectors, and they use those things to kind of gauge where I'm at. There's a whole thing called quality function deployment that they do, QFD analysis that they do, and they get into that, I think that's probably going to be beyond the core lean theory, but there's a whole part of how you design for lean and design for Six Sigma are out there. Very different topic though, but it is how the organization projects out. Same thing with public services, same thing with hospitals, the shaping function. But the key is, in this concept for lean theory, when you're looking at how do we better supply or service people, you have to have a definition that isn't controllable by the leadership within the organization.
Sounds like you could take this another step and talk about so-called resilient lean, because there you can have, depending on how resilient or robust you want the overall system.
We are over, by the way, so I don't want to hold people. We are at 2:15, so I don't want to hold people longer. But I appreciate the feedback. This has been very helpful. And the causal loop in the module is dead.
Yeah, well,
I wouldn't throw it out. I mean, brainstorming is good.
Between the modules is a line.
Yes, I'm putting them on at the end. I'm putting it together. This is kind of feedback, so I can pull out clutter, make clear. I'm going to look at production factors, because that seems what I want is someone who's in the. I've consulted military healthcare, and I get is, oh, that lean stuff. Well, it's for profit. It doesn't work here, and you get that resistance continually. But if it's something that they can understand, and that's why I don't want to use terms like profit. Or I want to use generic terms that aren't going to turn off one crowd or the other.
Yeah, well, for those kind of audiences, if you talk about
national security is a public benefit.
Resiliency,
that's security assurance.
Yeah, that's a.
With the military, they talk about sustainment, and I'm like, that's not a word. And then they're like, well, how about operationalizing? I'm like, that's not a word either. So they go, oh, great, operationalizing sustainment. So thank you very much. I think any questions from out in the field? We've had a great conversation here. Hopefully you were able to hear. Any questions from the participants?
I can. This is Jim. I was going to talk to you about.
We can barely hear.
Can you hear me?
So, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So when you talk about your waste widgets, how does that? Where do you have your value stream mapping, which identifies processing? Because you have processing weight, over processing, etc.
Sure.
So you would quantify those. So those are kind of like process steps.
So this is even more fundamental than value. The question was, Jim, it's for some reason the volume is coming out of the computer, not the TV. I figured out what the error was. The volume's routing through the computer. Jim's asked, you do value stream mapping traditionally in lean. That's how you identify waste. Where is that in this? This is almost at the atomic level, and value stream mapping is looking at an ecosystem. Traditionally, you use 5S to find value in the environment. You use value stream mapping to find value in a process, and then you use SMED or accelerators to find value in a single step. This is something that simply helps identify how waste grows in the first place if you leave it untended. And one of the ways to limit waste Specifically in value stream mapping, these two here come up very frequently. Overprocessing, which is people doing more than is needed, and overproduction is building or creating more than is needed. So what this would look like in a value stream, Jim, that you would look for is if we don't have a limit on how much we do, we're just going to keep doing it whether we need to do it or not. Nothing's going to signal us to stop, and we're going to keep building. So you want to have that demand signal that the customer doesn't need anymore, because otherwise you keep producing and that extra production is waste. Same thing with inventory. I've done ones with servers where they were building servers to deploy out to the IT floor, and they were building them without having a demand signal. So they would build servers, and then they would have them configured incorrectly because the customer said, no, I want this. Doing work, the Agile's entire purpose of this, the Agile backlog is a concept of this, the sprint. The reason you do a sprint gets to, you don't want to have too much of a buffer of how much you're working at any one time, because the waste in it grows because you haven't put a limit on it. That's also, I think, demonstrated in the project dynamics with the changes and things like that. There's many reasons why the waste grows. I don't have a causal explanation of why the waste grows, but it does grow. So this appears in many, many value streams. Does that answer your question, Jim?
Partially.
Okay.
We'll talk. Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Hearing nothing from the computer. We're going to have to figure out why the volume's coming to the computer. I apologize. So, all right. Thank you very much. I will stop recording and appreciate everyone's attendance.